in a series called The First Gospel. You guys know this. The basic idea is that the New Testament does not hold a monopoly on good news, that God has always been good, that he was good in the very beginning of the story. That's actually how the story started, and it was all very good, right? And then beyond that he continues to be good. He didn't get angry and grumpy for a long time until Jesus finally came along, but he's always been good. He's always been in the business of being good to us and kind to us and loving to us. And so we are looking through the Old Testament this year to see the goodness of God on every page. Right now we're still in Genesis. You guys have heard me say before that Genesis should be required reading for the entire human race. So we're spending a lot of time here because it tells the story of who God is, who we are, what God is up to, and how we can partner with him in that work. So we've been here for a bit. We spent some time last couple of weeks talking about a guy named Abraham. I'm not going to recap for the sake of time. You can find those messages on our podcast, YouTube channel, whatever you got to do. But tonight we're going to talk about Abraham's son Isaac just a bit, but more importantly about his grandson Jacob. So Abraham eventually has a son Isaac. We told the story, I think last week, of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, which is this crazy, bizarre moment in his life, but he survived it by the grace of God and went on to have a family of his own. So Isaac married a woman named Rebekah. They had two sons, Jacob and Esau. But like many of the stories of the patriarchs, they struggled initially with infertility. Same with Abraham and Sarah. And you'll remember when Abraham and Sarah were going through this, their solution was to take matters into their own hands. Sleep with my handmaiden Hagar. We'll see how this works out. And it caused all sorts of strife in the family. Now, Isaac and Rebekah, on the other hand, when they were having a hard time getting pregnant, the first thing that Isaac did, according to the Bible, is he prayed. Okay, so we're moving forward. These guys are learning something. Instead of taking matters into their own hands, they ask God to do something. Isaac intercedes on Rebekah's behalf, is how the Bible portrays it. And God answers the prayer, and she becomes pregnant. And her pregnancy apparently is a little bit tumultuous because she's feeling all sorts of stuff going on in her stomach. And so she goes to ask God, like, what is going on? And he says, two nations are struggling with each other inside your womb. And then he goes on to say, and the younger will rule over the older. Okay, this is all in Genesis 25 and then spilling into 26. We'll read some of the story in a bit, but I'm struggling tonight because the stories that we're telling in the book of Genesis will span 7 or 8 chapters. And you don't want me to stand up here and read 7 or 8 chapters. So I'm kind of summarizing, and we'll dive into little bits and pieces of the story in the text in a second. But two nations struggling in your womb, the younger will rule over the older. Now, this is highlighting another major biblical theme that happens over and over and over again, where in culture of the day, the firstborn was the preferred child, especially the firstborn son. So the firstborn son would receive all of the inheritance, well, not all of it, but the bulk of the inheritance. They would receive the father's blessing, all this other good stuff, and everybody else was kind of second-class citizens. But over and over again in the story, and we're going to see it not just here, but moving on through the story, God shows a preference not for the firstborn, but for the secondborn, or even later. I mean, we see that. You guys know the story of David. David is the youngest of the sons, the last one picked. We'll see a story actually with the grandsons of Jacob, where when Jacob goes to bless his grandsons, his son Joseph puts his two children on either side, the oldest on the right and the youngest on the left, and Jacob will literally take his hands like this and he'll cross them over and place them on the opposite hand, so the right hand on the younger son. It's this way of showing that God just kind of sees the world differently than the rest of us do. And this is really important. Basically, what we see from Genesis on into the New Testament even is God doesn't see the world the way we do, and God doesn't choose people on the basis of the things that we choose people for. And that's kind of encouraging, right? I mean, unless you walk into this room and think that you've got it all figured out and you are like the cream of the crop, then, man, that's encouraging to know that God picks people who are kind of broken, kind of messed up, maybe kind of the people that would get overlooked otherwise, and says, I can do something with that. I can do something with somebody who's humble and surrendered and faithful and obedient. I can work with that. And it's those people over and over and over again that have gone on to change the world. It's those people that we're still telling stories about all these centuries later. These big kings, these emperors who thought that they were everything. We don't even remember their names. I mean, can anybody in the room name like 6 Roman emperors, or 3 Persian emperors, or Babylonian emperors? No, we can't. But we're talking about Jacob and Saul, who would later become Paul, and David, and on and on and on these stories go. These people of faith and conviction and humility that are not the first person we would pick. But God sees something and says, I can work with that. So the younger will rule over the older. We're going to come back to this theme often. Rebecca takes this and she takes it to heart, and eventually would have 2 children. Now this is where the story gets interesting. 2 nations struggling in her womb. Esau is born first, her firstborn son. He comes out of the womb, but as he's coming out, they notice that attached to his heel, attached to his ankle, is the hand of the other brother, as if he's trying to pull him back in and take his place. Okay, so now what ends up happening is the 2 of them are given names based on kind of the circumstances of their birth. So we start with Esau. His name sounds like the Hebrew word for hair. Okay, so he comes out this fuzzy little dude. Like, we're going to find out just how hairy he is in just a second, okay? But Esau comes out very hairy. He's also going to get another name later which is Edom, and that means red. So if that gives you any impression, we got this like little chimpanzee kind of guy that comes out first, but with a hand attached to his ankle. And this is Jacob. They name him Jacob, and his name literally means grabs at the heel, or heel grabber, okay? So he's grabbing at the heel of his brother, trying to pull him back in, trying to secure a station, a spot for himself, which is really, really important. We'll come back to that also in a second. But they name him heel grabber, and that is interesting because in Hebrew, that word is also an idiom. Heel grabber also means a deceiver or a trickster. And if you think of it, it's a pretty simple image, right? When you're grabbing at somebody's heel, you're trying to trip them. You're trying to trip them up, and that's what a deceiver does, is they try to trip you or try to fool you. And this will be a major theme of Jacob's life. He is constantly, specifically with Esau, trying to trip him up, trying to deceive him, trying to take what belonged to Esau. Now, what's unique about this is what? God had promised from before they were born that the younger would rule over the older. So, now we can't blame Jacob as a baby, but kind of this baby origin story is going to be a theme throughout his life. If he had just chilled out and come out second, rather than striving to be first, he would have been born into the position of God's blessing already. Because God had already promised the second will rule over the first. But he's trying to be first still, even in this. And this becomes a theme of his life. God has spoken a blessing over him. But for whatever reason, it never really landed with him. And he was constantly striving to be what God said he already was. Okay? Now, what does that sound like? Adam and Eve, right? The serpent comes to them in the garden and says, if you eat this fruit, you will be like God. The story's already tipped us off, though, that they're already made in the image of God. So all Adam or Eve would have had to say in response is, we are already like God, and problem solved. So the nature of sin, the nature of temptation is to try to convince you that you're not enough, despite being made in the image of God, and that you need something else to secure yourself, to be enough. And that's what we have here with Jacob. God has promised before he's born, has spoken a destiny and a blessing over this kid. And yet it's never enough. And throughout his entire life, he's always going to try to take through deception what God has already promised him. So the question that Jacob is wrestling with throughout his life is, do I want to participate in the blessing of God, the path that God has already blessed for me, or do I want to participate in the curse of temptation, trying to strive for something that's already true of me if I would just surrender into it? Does that make sense? It's a pretty crazy journey that's epitomized from the moment he's born. And then it continues throughout his life as he starts to live into that heel grabber, that deceiver mentality. You guys have all heard the stories, but Esau is apparently, he's a man's man. Isaac loved Esau. Rebekah loved Jacob. Jacob would stay home. The Bible literally says would stay home among the women, just kind of doing the stuff that they would do in the camp. Esau would go out hunting into the woods. On one of these occasions, Esau was out hunting, and he came back really, really hungry. And so he tells Jacob had made this pot of stew, and then this is where he gets his name Edom from, because in Hebrew it doesn't say stew, it says red. He had made a pot of red, whatever that is. It's Adom. So he comes in and says, give me some of that stew. Give me some of that red stuff, you know? And Jacob says, why should I give this to you? This is mine. I made it. Tell you what, I'll sell it to you. And Esau says, what do you want? What do you want for it? He says, your birthright. So basically he's saying, name me the firstborn. Again, remember, I'm sure his mom had to have told him, God is speaking this blessing over the second child, yet he has to be the firstborn. He's grasping onto something that if he would just relax into God's plan for his life, everything would be okay. But Esau says, what good is a birthright if I'm about to die? Now, we don't know if Esau is just being dramatic, if he was really on the edge of death, if this was just really good stew, or if he just didn't care. You know, if it's one of those things like, yeah, I'll tell him whatever he wants to hear. And who's going to believe him later, you know? Because it doesn't seem like it makes that big of a difference in the story. So he says, whatever, you can have the birthright, give me the stew. Nothing much comes of this, but it'll circle back later in their lives. When their father Isaac is old and kind of nearing death. The Bible says he was blind, and he was looking to pass on the blessing. This is a recurring theme in the life of Jacob, the blessing of the firstborn onto his son Esau. So he tells his wife Rebekah, send Esau to me and have him bring some of that wild game that he makes that I like so much. And I'm going to eat it, we're going to have a meal together, and I'm going to bless my firstborn son. Kind of this, it's almost this last will and testament moment. I'm going to speak this father's blessing over my firstborn. Really powerful. So Rebekah tells Esau, he goes off into the wilderness to hunt wild game, and she says, Jacob, we have an opportunity. She's in on this. We have an opportunity to take the blessing that God promised you. Now, I want to be clear on this. God promised a blessing. Rebekah knew it, and now here she is trying to manipulate the situation to make that happen. And what's crazy about this is as the story unfolds, she will be successful. And that leads us to all sorts of questions about the will of God. You know, like, was it God's will for Rebekah to be manipulative, for Jacob to be a deceiver? Is that how he brought this about? And the answer is no. We can't look at that and say they did the right thing. This is this complex interplay between like human will and God's sovereignty. You know what I mean? At the end of all of this, we're gonna see two things very clearly. We're gonna see that God is in complete control and is absolutely sovereign, and nothing will stop his will from being done. And on the other hand, that we have responsibility for our actions and will be held responsible for our actions. Now, how can those two things coexist? You know, how can God be in complete control, yet we have responsibility? I don't fully know the answer to that question, but that's what the Bible shows us over and over again, you know? There's those famous verses that talk about kind of the gateway to heaven, where on one side, you know, somebody once said, on one side of the door, it says, choose the narrow path, or choose today whom you're going to serve. You know, that like you make the choice what you're going to do. And then you walk through the door and you turn around and you look and it says, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you. You know, that how does this work together? And the story doesn't resolve this for us. It leaves it in this kind of mystery where God is in control and he will bless this kid. Yet Jacob and Rebekah did the wrong thing. And the result of that is all sorts of devastation that comes along with the blessing that I don't think is God's intention. It's not his will. See, we've talked about this before. God has two hands in the Bible. He's got the right hand, which is the path of blessing. And when you walk this path, you walk the path of God's blessing. You are in the flow of what he's doing in the world. And you are moving to the rhythms of his love. It doesn't mean things are going to be easy, but the wind is at your back. There are other times, however, where we say no to the path of God's blessing. And instead walk a path of brokenness and pain, making our own decisions and causing devastation and chaos for ourselves and those around us. But somehow, by the grace of God and his powerful left hand, he brings us back around to his purpose, to where he wanted us to be all along. Now, that road involves a lot more pain than it needed to. And that's what we're going to see in this story. They are responsible for making the wrong choices. Yet God still is determined, absolutely determined to bless them. We saw that in the Abraham story, right? God will not allow this covenant to fail. He will guarantee both halves of the covenant himself, no matter what. So here, Rebekah and Jacob, they do something despicable. They conspire to defraud the older brother out of his blessing by tricking a blind old man. I mean, this is like gross. But basically the story goes like this. Rebekah says, here's what you're going to do. Go get a couple of goats. I'm going to prepare it the way your father likes it. He won't know the difference. He's old. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to cover your arms in the goat's hair, okay? Again, this is how fuzzy Esau is. Like, he feels like a goat. So we're going to cover your arms and goat hair. And Jacob says, but when I get close to him, he's going to smell me. And he's going to know it's not me. He's like, you're going to wear Esau's clothes. She's got the whole thing figured out. So the story unfolds. that Jacob goes to his father with this pot of stew and says, Father, I've come for my blessing. I brought you what you want. I've come for my blessing. And Isaac says, you know what he says? Really poignant. He says, sorry, hold on. He feels his arms first. He goes to feel his arms. He feels the hair on his arms. And he feels it all fuzzy. He says, you feel like my son Esau, but the voice is Jacob's. The voice is Jacob's. So he's on to something here. So he basically says as a test, let me embrace you. Let me embrace you. So he goes to hold him, and he smells his son's clothes. And in that moment, you have to listen to what Isaac says here. This is in Genesis 27, verse 27. He says, the smell of my son. It's like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. It's this powerful moment where he smells his son, and he's filled with overwhelming love, and this blessing just pours out of him. And Jacob is hearing from his father the words he's been longing for his whole life. This father's blessing. He's born with this hole in him where he's just not enough. And he's looking for that blessing, and he thinks that getting it from his father is going to do it. And in this moment, he just hears it, and it's exactly what he's wanted his entire life. Do you think that it landed with him? Do you think that filled the hole that he was looking to fill? Of course not. We're going to find out in just a second that blessing is effective, that it actually does what it's supposed to do in his life. But it didn't land with him. Why? Because it wasn't for him. It wasn't for him. It wasn't the real him, and you cannot bless a fake. Jacob presented himself with a mask. He's the deceiver. He's showing up as somebody else, receiving somebody else's blessing. We do this all the time to God. We show up in front of him with this fake mask that we portray to everybody else, what spiritual directors call the false self. This false self that we put on, and we expect a blessing from God, and he won't do it. Because you cannot bless something that's not real. You can't receive the blessing of God in your false self. So this blessing doesn't land with Jacob. We're going to see that it doesn't mean anything to him in this moment. It will mean something sort of existentially. Everything Isaac speaks over him will happen. But it didn't fill the hole that he was looking to fill. Because you can't be blessed unless you come authentic, unless you come real to the presence of your Father. So Jacob leaves. He leaves this moment unblessed and unfulfilled, despite receiving the Father's blessing. Now, a few minutes later, Esau shows up with the stew that he had made, that he had gone out into the wilderness hunting for, that he'd kind of done everything his father had asked. He showed up and said, Dad, I'm ready for my blessing. And Isaac says, what do you mean? And they have a conversation where they realize what's happened. And Isaac is furious, and Esau is furious, and he begins to sob. He begs, Father, bless me too, please. And I think this is so fascinating because you know what Isaac says? I've already given the blessing, my son. And then there's this moment in Hebrew, and it's so painful because it says, I have blessed him, and he will be blessed. And I just think that's so fascinating because if it was me, I would just say, oh, he lied, that little jerk. I got to take it all back. But here, Isaac considers the blessing to be irrevocable. You can't take it back. And I think there's something in here that we have to pay attention to, which is just the power of words. In the ancient Near East, you didn't just say something. If you said something, your word was your bond. And when Isaac speaks these words into the world, even if it's to somebody who's deceiving him, it's done. These words have weight. They have significance. They have landed in the life of his son. And more than just the power of words in general, the power of a father's words over his son. He spoke these words to his son, these words of blessing, and he's saying, I will not take that back. My son heard me speak blessing over his life. I'm not going to change it. I'm sorry, Esau, I have very little left to give you. He does end up speaking a blessing over Esau, but it's like second rate. It's terrible. You guys should read. Like if I were Esau, I would be angry. Esau was angry. Furious, in fact. He goes into a rage and decides he's going to kill his brother Jacob. But what's so fascinating is he says, this is crazy, he says, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob after my father has passed away and the time of mourning is over. So he's in this rage, but he manages to control himself because he doesn't want to bring more pain upon his family. And he wants to allow his entire family time to mourn when his father has passed away. He's the better brother. Like, it's clear if you read this story, the one commentator I read actually said, it's clear reading Genesis that the narrator likes Esau better than Jacob. That God has he's not only not chosen the firstborn, he's chosen the second. He's actually also chosen the worst one, the despicable one, the gross one. Like Esau seems to be a man of integrity or character. He's got his issues. He's a little naive, he's a little impulsive, all this kind of stuff. But here he says, I'm going to take my revenge, but only after my family's been given time to grieve. Crazy. He is clearly the better character, which leads us to say, why Jacob? He's not heroic at all. Some of the characters in this story have their bad moments and their good moments. Jacob has no good moments. It's just negative deception throughout his entire story. And yet God chooses him. And what's so surprising about this is remember what God said to Rebekah. 2 nations are in your womb. This is actually the origin story of 2 nations. So we'll have, out of Jacob will come the Israelites, and out of Esau will come the Edomites. And if you read on later in the story, these are enemies. They're enemies to each other. So when you read this story, you're reading the story of like how 2 nations came to be opposed to one another. And you would expect that if this is a story written by and for the Israelites, that they would be the heroes of the story and the Edomites would be these kind of buffoons and awful people. But the Edomites, Esau, is actually painted as the noble character here, which tells you what? The Bible is utterly realistic in its portrayal of its heroes. They're not heroic. They're not heroic. Who's the hero of this story? God is. And what does God do? He chooses people because he wants to. Because he wants to display his grace and his forgiveness through broken vessels, not through perfect people. Yahweh doesn't play the karma game. It's not about getting what you deserve. It's often about getting what you don't deserve. And this little deceiver, Jacob, is blessed over and over and over again, while Esau suffers the pain of deception and loss. That commentator I referenced earlier says, God's grace works even against the taste of the narrator. That God is opposing even what the narrator wants to happen. Like you could almost read the begrudging telling of the story. Esau should be getting all this blessing, but Jacob gets it time and time again. But again, because of the way he went about it, the blessing doesn't land in his life. He's not living in the blessing. He's not participating in the blessing of God. Instead, he's participating in the curse of sin. He's participating in this hole inside of him that's never filled, never enough. He's not living in the fullness of the blessing. And the result is, as I've said a couple of times, devastation in his family. His mom, Rebekah, finds out that Esau is going to take revenge, and so she goes to Isaac and says, please send your son Jacob away. She comes up with this thing like, I don't want him marrying a Canaanite, so send him back to Mesopotamia where he can marry one of our relatives. So basically, Rebekah says, Jacob, you got to get out of here. Your brother's going to kill you. Run away. And he runs away into the wilderness, which leads us to our next story, which is in Genesis 28. So he runs into the wilderness, and here's what happens. This is Genesis 28:10. Jacob had left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, and he lay down to sleep. And he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father, Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land upon which you're lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. When Jacob awoke, I love this. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, but I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he placed under his head and set it up as a pillar, poured oil on top of it, and he called the place Bethel, which means the house of God, although it used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Fascinating story. God shows up. So here, Jacob flees from home. We'll find out later, never to see his mother and father again. They both pass away while he's gone. So that's some of the devastation and brokenness of not living in the right hand of God, not living the path of blessing, is all this loss and pain. He'll never see his mother and father again. He's sent out into the wilderness, and it says he arrived, I love this in Hebrew, it says he arrived at a certain place. In other words, a place that wasn't important enough to have a name, you know? I remember I went to this restaurant when I was a kid, and it had a sign that said, on this spot in 1764, nothing happened. It's kind of one of those sort of places, you know? We don't understand those places if you grew up in Southern California. You don't get that, because when you leave Costa Mesa, you're in Irvine. And when you leave Irvine, you're in, there's Santa Ana, and there's Tustin, there's Anaheim, and they all run together, and you're never nowhere. But I grew up in Montana. And when you leave one town, there'd be 100 miles of nothing, of nowhere, of nameless place. And that's what this is. It's just a place. He was in a certain place where nothing important had ever happened. So in other words, the Bible's saying he's in the middle of nowhere. The middle of nowhere. He has fled the comforts of home. He has fled everything he's ever known, and he finds himself in the middle of nowhere. And he laid down to sleep with his head on a rock. Why would you sleep with your head on a rock? Because you had nothing else to put your head on. You didn't have an extra cloak with you. You didn't have anything else to ball up. All you had was a rock. That's the only conceivable reason a person would lay down with their head on a rock. You had nothing else. So in the middle of nowhere, completely exposed and alone, terrified from the past, processing regret and doubt, worried about the future. He doesn't have any provisions, anything with him, and he finds himself alone in this place. Now, what he's not doing here is he's not praying. He's not seeking God at all. As a matter of fact, he's going to point out a little bit later that he had about the same spiritual insight that the rock he was sleeping on did. Had no idea, wasn't even looking for God. But in an act of grace, God showed up and gave him a vision. And what did the vision say? It's this staircase leading between heaven and earth with the throne of God at the top and angels moving back and forth. The word angel in Hebrew means messenger. They walk, they don't fly. They're walking up and down this staircase, delivering messages. Now, what does that say to this guy who's in the middle of the wilderness, all by himself, completely exposed, worried about the past, worried about the future? What does it say to him? God is at work. You can't see it. It might be a long time in coming, but he is still at work. His messengers are moving back and forth between the two to be sure that the will of God will be accomplished. And that will has been spoken over his life so many times. He will be blessed. He will be a great nation. He will rule over his brother. All of this, it hasn't stopped. God is still working toward that end. And that's what wilderness seasons are often for. When you leave the comfort of the known, whether because you wanted to or you had to, but you haven't yet arrived in the comfort of the next. And you find yourself in this place, this space between spaces where nothing important happens. This, as Dr. Seuss calls it, this waiting place. And you're just waiting for something to show up. God is at work. The words he has spoken over you in the past are still valid. His word will do what he said it would do. He's at work. That's what he shows Jacob. He shows him first this vision. I'm still at work. Don't be afraid. And then, I love this, it says, and then it showed God standing over, in Hebrew it says, standing over it. Only that's not what it says in Hebrew exactly. I mean, that's how NIV is translated. It says, at the top of the staircase, basically, you see a vision of God. But there's two ways you can translate that passage. It's either at the top of the staircase, so over it, which is the staircase, or over him. which means that God has descended the staircase and is now standing over the sleeping Jacob, which actually makes a lot more sense in Genesis. If you read the rest of Genesis, God often appears alongside people, next to them. If you read later on in the story, in Isaiah and stuff, we'll see him like way up in the sky. But often in Genesis, he appears alongside. So it makes a lot more sense, both from the grammar that's used here, but also from the context. That it's not he was standing over the staircase, but he was standing over Jacob, standing over him. And he speaks this blessing, this powerful blessing that sounds a lot like what he told his father Isaac and what he told his grandfather Abraham. And you just have to, there's a part of you that just has to wonder again, why? Like, why this guy? He's out here because he screwed up. Nobody did anything wrong to him. He's here because of his choices. Why are you blessing him? And it's just as if God is standing there saying, like, to all of us through time that are asking that question, just grace. This is what I do. I'm not going to hold his failures against him. I promise to work through him, and I'm going to work through him. Come hell or high water, I will not let this covenant fall. It's powerful, just the grace of God in this moment, to bless a man who does not deserve it. And suddenly, in this wilderness season, we are pierced by the presence of God. He just breaks in. And I love what Jacob says. He says, surely this is the house of God, even though I didn't even know it. Surely God is here, even though I wasn't aware of it. And I just want to say that to you. If you find yourself in a wilderness season tonight where you're like, where are you, God? He is at work, though we can't see it. And I pray for myself and for all of us in this room that he would pierce this wilderness season with a vision of his presence. And we would say, like Jacob, surely you were in it all along. And if you're in it, that's enough. That's enough. Just grace. But Jacob still doesn't get it. I love this. The guy is like dense as a rock. Because he basically makes this vow. Okay, God, okay. God has just promised this unconditional blessing. He didn't ask him to do anything. He just said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to sustain you. And what does Jacob say? If. So if you follow through, if you give me food, if you give me water, if you bring me back safely to where I'm coming from, then if you do all this, then what does Jacob say? I'll give you a tenth. What a guy. If you bless me and give me everything my heart's ever desired, if you fill this hole inside of me, I will give you a tenth of everything I own. He still clearly doesn't understand the grace of God. He doesn't understand this God who's extending himself in covenant relationship to this deceiver who doesn't deserve it. If I were in Jacob's shoes, realizing how little I deserve from God, it would be like, anything you give me is more than I deserve. But here he is making deals, even in this moment. And we'll see the story. I'm not going to read the story of what happens next. He goes to Mesopotamia, where he lives with his uncle named Laban. He falls in love with his second cousin, so-and-so, named Rachel. But him and his uncle have this contentious relationship where they are both, like Jacob finally meets his match, where Laban deceives Jacob and Jacob deceives Laban, and they basically go back and forth for years, just messing with each other, you know? I mean, you guys all know this story. Jacob wanted to marry Laban's daughter Rachel. But Laban dressed up his other daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob on the wedding day, and he didn't know. And so he had to work even longer to marry the other daughter Rachel, and that's how the entire relationship was. And it's just this, like Jacob's tricking Laban and Laban's tricking Jacob, and eventually Jacob runs away in the middle of the night, takes his entire family, takes all the herds that he's, like all the wealth that he's gained, and just runs away, and Laban chases him down with an army. I mean, this is like a nasty, messed up relationship. Again, this is what happens when you take the blessing of God but don't participate in it. When you're taking it all, but you're not actually living a blessed life. And so this just kind of messy relationship that ultimately, because God has promised to protect and bless Jacob, he does. His father-in-law comes after him with an army, and he ends up hugging him, kissing him, and blessing him on his way. It's like crazy. But Jacob is going back home at the end of this story because God told him to go back home. And so we'll pick up the story in Genesis 32. This is our last story of the night. Genesis 32, he's going back home. And he kind of gets to the edge of the promised land. And he sees an angel of God kind of camped out right next to his camp. Now, so he sees a vision of God's protection as he's heading back. He's not sure what he's going to encounter when he gets back to the promised land. He's not sure what the situation with his brother is going to be like. He's got this huge family now, 12 sons, 4 wives, bunch of wealth that he's accumulated. Like it's gone from just him alone to this massive now camp. And he arrives at the edge of the promised land, and God gives him a vision of an angelic camp that mirrors his own. As if to say, I've got you. It's going to be okay. I promise to take care of you. And so Jacob names the place. He calls it 2 camps. One is his camp, and one is the Lord's camp. He's recognizing now that there are 2 overlapping spaces, that even if I can't see it, that God is at work. Okay, so this is all good so far. So now he's got 2 camps. He's got his camp and he's got the angel's camp. He's feeling confident. So he sends the messengers ahead to tell Esau that he's coming. The messengers go and they tell Esau, your brother Jacob is coming. And so what does Esau do is he puts together a group of 400 armed men to march out to meet his brother. So the messengers come back to Jacob and they say, your brother Esau is coming to meet you with 400 armed men. In other words, with an army. And Jacob, rather than standing on the reality of the 2 camps, okay, what does he do? He splits his camp into 2. Okay, there's a lot of irony in this story. So we have the angelic camp and the physical camp of Jacob. But as soon as he finds out that Esau's coming, he forgets all about the angelic camp, and he splits his camp into 2, his rationale being, if Esau attacks one of them, he'll only kill these guys and not these guys. Okay, so he's already trying to make plans to mitigate the damage. He's trying to take matters back into his own hands. Then he decides, you know what I'll do? Actually, I've got a better strategy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this procession of gifts that I'm going to send to Esau. So he basically puts a group of people together with livestock, with gold, with silver, with everything he's accumulated while he's been away, and he sends them on ahead. And then he puts another group together behind them, same kind of vibes, with more livestock and more stuff, and he sends them behind. And basically what happens is as Esau is marching out to meet him with these 400 armed men, he is met by wave after wave after wave of gift. Pretty crazy, right? So he's figuring by the time he gets to me, maybe he'll be cool with me. Maybe we'll be okay. Just wave after wave of gifts coming his direction. Again, Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, the schemer, he's figuring out a way to manipulate his brother. The result, though, is that eventually he finds himself on the edge of the promised land again, once again in the wilderness, alone. He has sent everything on ahead of him, and he's alone. And that's when this last story that I'm going to read happens. We're almost done, I promise. Okay. Genesis 32:22. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he'd sent them across the stream, he sent all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When this man saw that he couldn't overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched, and as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, oh, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what's your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Crazy story. Okay, so Jacob sends everything ahead of him. He's got this scheme to try to pacify, to manipulate his brother, but the result is he finds himself once again on the edge of the wilderness alone. Now, this time it's a little different. He's there not because he's running from something, but because he's obeying the word of God. He's going back home like God told him to. But he's in this weird place between faith and doubt, where he's there because of obedience, and he's now aware that God is with him in a way he wasn't before. Yet he's still trying to take matters into his own hands. He's still living out of that hole, that emptiness, that heel grabber self, that false self. And so what does God do? When Jacob's alone, exposed, terrified, his brother's coming to him with an army of 400 men, what does he do? He attacks him. Crazy, isn't it? You would expect that the God that often gets preached in churches on Sunday mornings would have come and comforted him. Pat him on the back, put his arm around his shoulder, told him it was going to be okay. Gave him just a little sprinkle of blessing, a little fairy dust, been really gentle and really kind with this guy who was in a vulnerable spot, who was there out of obedience. But he's been doing that Jacob's whole life, and it's not making a difference. It's not breaking. He's been comforting him. He's been showing him that he's with him. He's been there in his life in so many ways, and it's not breaking through this false self, this deceiver, this heel grabber persona that Jacob has. It's not breaking through the manipulation or the tendency to want to take control of situations. It's not breaking through the lack of trust and the doubt. And so God finally says, there's only one way this is going to work, and it's going to hurt. But he comes after him. And he attacks him, and it says this man, it starts out with a man. This man wrestled with him until daybreak. And it says when he saw he couldn't overpower him, he touched his hip. And Jacob's hip was wrenched from its socket, so that he was maimed in this moment where he's going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But in this moment of touching, it's fascinating because in that moment, something shifted in the mind of Jacob. I've heard a lot of people, a lot of commentators talk about this strike that God gave Jacob on the hip, this like powerful blow, but that's not what it says in Hebrew. You have to understand, Hebrew is a very violent language. There are plenty of words to talk about striking and smiting and slaying people. If what they meant here was he punched him in the hip, it would have said that. But the word is a gentle touch. A gentle touch, and his entire leg was completely useless. And in this moment, Jacob began to realize that this is no man. Something supernatural just happened to me. Painful, but supernatural. And what's fascinating is when we call this story Jacob wrestles with God, but that's not really accurate, is it? It's God wrestles with Jacob. Jacob didn't pick a fight. He was just minding his own business when God attacked him. And what do you do when somebody attacks you? What's your posture? Right? You're defensive. You're trying to push the person away. You're trying to get yourself free, to get yourself out of this situation. And that's got to be Jacob's posture when God attacks him. Get away from me, get away from me. But when he touches him on the hip and he realizes that something supernatural is happening, his posture changes. And he goes from this to this. Do you see it? Because then the man says, let go of me. Now Jacob is holding on to him. He's grabbing him with everything he has. And he says, I will not let go until you bless me. And this is the moment of transformation in Jacob's life. Do you see it? He's finally grabbing the right thing. The heel grabber has been deceiving. He's been trying to fill this hole with everything else in his life for his entire life. And finally, he realizes that God is here. And this is what I wanted. This is what I needed. I needed him the whole time. He's been trying to show up in my life. He's been trying to bless me. And I've been resistant. I've been manipulative. I've been faithless. But here he is, and I'm not going to let him go. And finally, he is participating in the blessing. He's holding on to the blessing for the first time in his life. You know, Paul talks about it in Philippians. He says, I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus has taken hold of me. You see that image? Paul's saying, Jesus got me. He got a hold of me. But now I want to hold on to him too. Because that's relationship. That's how the blessing of the Christian life works. So often in our lives, we expect Jesus to just drag us somewhere, you know? It's like when Elijah was little and we take him to the grocery store and you're heading to the vegetable section and he's heading to the toy section. It's like you walk into the store holding hands and I'm holding on to him, but pretty soon he's not holding on to me. Now I'm dragging him through the grocery store. You know what I mean? And sometimes that's how it is. That's how it is with Jacob. God is trying to bless him, and he's trying to bless him, and he's trying to bless him. He's saying, Jacob, I've got you. I've got you. I am holding you. In every moment, I am surrounding you with my presence. But Jacob is running every which direction, and finally, he stops, and he grabs hold of the one who's been holding on to him the whole time. And in this moment, everything changes. He's finally participating in the blessing instead of participating in the curse. And God blesses him. He speaks a new name over him. He calls him Israel, wrestles with God, or wrestled by God. Your life is now redefined by this struggle. You have wrestled with me and you won. I love that. Now, it's going to cost him. He'll walk funny the rest of his life. There's a pain. There's a real danger in that experience. C.S. Lewis says, this is not a tame lion we're talking about. He's not safe. But he's good, and sometimes his goodness requires wounding for the sake of healing. That's what he's done here. He's hurt Jacob so that he can heal him. He's wounded him so that he can bless him. And he's changed in the process. God gives him a new name and a new story, a new destiny. It's really powerful. But again, I'm going to land with this. The thing that I hate about it, though, is it shouldn't have been him. It should have been Esau. You know? I mean, because when Jacob finally gets to Esau, you know what happens? Forgives him. That army of 400 men he brought, it wasn't an army, it was a welcoming party. It's almost like Jacob is like trying to wade through these like gifts, like what are all these sheep doing here? I just want to see my brother. And when he sees him, he embraces him and he forgives him. Esau's the hero of the story. Esau shows the most of the character of God, shows the most integrity and compassion and grace. Yet Jacob gets blessed. That bothers me. But Jesus makes sense of this for us. It's actually in John 1. I didn't put the verse on the screen, but you know that whole Stairway to Heaven scene that we saw? Where there's a stairway with angels ascending and descending. And it says that angels were ascending and descending, and it said in Hebrew, it said on the staircase, on it. And on it, angels were ascending and descending the throne of God, okay? So hold on to that on it phrase. That story will reappear one more time in the Bible. You guys remember in John chapter 1, when Nathanael was told about Jesus, he says, his friend Philip comes to him and says, we found the Messiah in Nazareth. And Nathanael says, in Nazareth? Like, nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And he says, just come and see. So Nathanael comes up to Jesus, and Jesus calls out from a distance. This is an Israelite who basically speaks his mind. You know, he's like, I know, basically like, I know what you said about me. You know, like this is a guy who doesn't deceive. He just says what's on his mind. And Nathanael basically says, how do you know me? Remember this? How do you know me? And Jesus says, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. We don't know what's going on there, but whatever it is so powerful. Whatever happened under that fig tree was so private that the fact that Jesus knew it just floored Nathanael, and he basically falls on his face and says, my King and my God. So he's convinced in that moment. You know what Jesus says? Listen to this. He basically says, that's nothing. Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So Jesus moves back to this moment. And he says, you think that me seeing you under the fig tree is impressive? You're going to see heaven opened, and you'll see angels walking, ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now notice what he doesn't say. He does not say, ascending and descending from the Son of Man. Okay, so the picture is not Jesus sitting on the throne of God, sending his angels back and forth. He does not say, ascending and descending to the Son of Man. So coming from the throne of God back and forth to the Son of Man. He says, on the Son of Man. What does that mean? Remember what Jacob said when he had that vision? He said, surely this is the gate, the gateway of heaven. This staircase is the gateway to heaven. And what does Jesus say? I'm the stairs. They're going to ascend and descend on me. I'm the way. I'm how you get in and out. I am how you see that God is at work. I am how you see the grace and goodness of God. I am how you receive the blessing. And that is why Jacob, though he did not deserve it, because Jesus made a way. And it's the same for all of us. Anyone who receives him sees in their lives angels, messengers of God, ascending and descending to them, providing everything we need, everything we could ever need because of him. Every blessing, Paul says, is given to us in Christ Jesus. In him, God's answer is yes and amen. That's how this works. Why, Jacob? Because God is good. And Jesus points back to this story to say, I want to show you just how good I am. If you believe, you'll see the blessing of God. It'll come on me. It'll come through me. It'll come by way of me. I just encourage you with that tonight. Let's pray.